By the time Maya realized there would be no birthday candles, her suitcase was already sitting in the rain.
You are 20 now, Maya. It is time you learn to take care of yourself.
This is my home. Your father wanted you to become independent. My father would never call abandonment independence.
According to the document in Victoria's hands, Charles had left his daughter nothing.
The signature appears valid, and the witnesses are on record.
Yeah.
Then look me in the eye and tell me my father chose this.
You prepare before the storm, not after it arrives. He planned for everything.
He planned for everything.
He labeled spare keys. He planned for system failures. He planned for broken promises. You expect me to believe he forgot his daughter? Your father knew you could survive without him. Do not use his name to make cruelty sound like love.
By the time Maya Carter realized there would be no birthday candles, her suitcase was already sitting in the rain. It was not even a real suitcase. It was a soft gray weekend bag with one broken zipper, packed so quickly that one sleeve of her favorite sweater hung out from the side like it had been caught trying to escape with her. The bag landed on the wet stone steps of the Carter mansion with a sound that was much too small for the end of a life. Maya stood beneath the wide front portico in San Francisco, a young black woman, newly turned 20, shivering in a black coat that still smelled faintly of funeral lilies. Behind her the house glowed with warm light, the marble foyer, the curved staircase, the framed photographs of charity galas and company launches, the polished world her father had built piece by piece until people in Silicon Valley spoke his name like it belonged beside buildings and patents and impossible ideas. And in front of her stood Victoria Carter, her stepmother, elegant and still. Victoria was a black woman in her mid-40s, with smooth, dark skin, carefully styled hair, and the kind of calm voice that made people lean closer at fundraisers. For 6 years, she had been introduced as Charles Carter's wife, the woman who understood public image, philanthropy, and power. She knew how to touch a donor's arm at the right moment. She knew how to smile for cameras. She knew how to make cruelty look like concern. For years, Maya had tried to believe there was grief beneath Victoria's coldness. She had told herself that people loved differently, that maybe Victoria's silence was just another kind of discipline, that maybe the woman who married her father did not know how to mother someone else's child. But after Charles died, Victoria stopped pretending. Charles Carter had been buried 7 days earlier. 7 days. That was all the distance between the last handful of dirt falling on his coffin and Victoria's voice telling Maya she no longer belonged in her own home. The rain came down harder. It struck the stone steps, ran along the carved edge of the walkway, and gathered at Maya's shoes. She looked past Victoria into the foyer, hoping for some sign that the house itself remembered her. The mark near the banister where she had dropped a music stand at 13. The faint scratch on the library door from a desk Charles had insisted on moving himself one Christmas. The little brass hook near his study, where he used to hang a leather camera bag before carrying her into the kitchen for pancakes. Everything was still there. Only Maya had been removed from the story. Victoria held a folder against her chest. She had carried it around all morning like a weapon wrapped in paper. According to the document inside, Charles Carter had changed his will shortly before his death. The new will left Carter Dynamics his personal accounts, his investment properties, his private archives, and the mansion to Victoria. Maya received nothing, not one share, not one room, not one letter. The attorney who had read the will earlier that afternoon would not meet Maya's eyes for more than a second. He was a black man with silver at his temples and a nervous way of touching his cufflinks. He explained that the signature appeared valid, that the witnesses were on record, and that grief often made families question decisions they did not understand. He spoke in a low, polished voice, as if politeness could make theft sound procedural. Maya had sat across the table from him with her hands folded so tightly that her knuckles hurt. She knew her father. Charles Carter had not been a careless man. He labeled chargers. He kept duplicate keys in fireproof envelopes. He wrote notes on yellow legal pads in a neat block hand. When Maya was little, he made her memorize 3 phone numbers and 2 safe places before she was allowed to walk to the corner store. He planned for delays, storms, system crashes, medical emergencies, and broken promises. He would not have left his only daughter with nothing but a bag of clothes and a birthday she would never celebrate. Maya said that out loud. Victoria's expression did not change. She simply told Maya that Charles had wanted her to learn independence. That was when something inside Maya went still. Independence was not abandonment. Her father had taught her that. He had raised her after her mother died, moving through grief with one hand on his company and the other always reaching back for his daughter. He took calls at midnight, then made breakfast at 7. He missed dinners sometimes, but he never missed the first day of school. He taught Maya that money was a tool, reputation was fragile, and family was not a performance for photographers. So when Victoria stood in that doorway and used Charles's name to justify cruelty, Maya felt the insult deeper than the eviction. Victoria told her she was 20 now, old enough to take care of herself, old enough to stop living inside a dead man's protection. Then she signaled to the security guard standing near the foyer. The guard was a broad-shouldered black man who had worked for Carter Dynamics for years. He looked ashamed, but shame did not stop him from lifting Maya's bag and carrying it to the front steps. Another employee placed the old leather camera bag beside it, almost gently. That small kindness hurt in a different way. Maya had not packed the camera bag. It had belonged to her father. Victoria must have thrown it in because she thought it was worthless. The leather was scuffed at the corners, the buckle scratched, the strap darkened from years against Charles's palm. It did not look like money. It did not look like power. It looked like memory. Victoria's final words were quiet enough that the rain almost swallowed them. She told Maya that if she caused trouble, she would regret it. Then the door closed. Not slammed, not dramatic, just closed with the soft, expensive click of a house sealing itself against weather. Maya stood there until the porch light switched off. Only then did she pick up both bags and walk into the rain. For the first hour she moved without direction. The city blurred around her in streaks of headlights and wet pavement. She did not cry at first. Her body was too busy solving immediate problems. Keep the phone dry. Watch the curb. Hold the camera bag close. Do not turn around. Do not give Victoria the satisfaction of seeing you come back to beg. By midnight, Maya found a small diner still open near a bus station. The place smelled of burned coffee, frying oil, and bleach. A tired black waitress behind the counter saw Maya's wet coat and did not ask questions. She simply pointed to the booth farthest from the door and brought her a mug of coffee with extra napkins. That kindness nearly broke her. Maya sat in the corner booth with her bags pressed against her legs. Outside, buses pulled in and out with tired sighs of air brakes. People came in with duffel bags, ordered toast, checked phones, left again. The world continued in small, ordinary motions, as if her father had not been buried, as if her stepmother had not stolen the house, as if Maya's name had not just been erased from everything Charles Carter had built. Eventually, she opened the weekend bag. 2 pairs of jeans, 3 shirts, a charger, a framed photograph from when she was 9, standing between her father and mother at the edge of the Golden Gate Park Conservatory. Her mother, Denise Carter, had been a black woman with laughing eyes and a face Maya could still remember most clearly in motion. Denise had died when Maya was 10, and after that, Charles kept photographs everywhere, not as a shrine, but as proof that love did not disappear just because a person did. Maya touched the picture frame with wet fingers and set it aside. Then she pulled the camera bag closer. The smell of old leather rose from it, and with it came a memory so clear that she could almost hear her father's laugh. Charles had carried that bag on business trips, family vacations, and long drives when he needed to think. It held a camera, a lens cloth, old receipts, and usually some ridiculous snack Maya had forgotten she asked for. When she was small, she loved opening every pocket, pretending it was a treasure chest. One pocket, though, was always locked. Charles used to tap that hidden compartment and tell her it was the safe place. "Only open it," he would say, "when you no longer know who to trust." Maya had always thought he was teasing. Charles was serious about safety, but he also liked games. He made scavenger hunts out of chores and turned passwords into riddles. When he said the camera bag had secrets, Maya imagined candy or a birthday card or some old photograph he wanted to save for the right day. Now in the corner of a diner, with rainwater drying at her cuffs, she noticed the seam. It ran along the inside lining of the locked compartment, almost invisible, unless the leather was bent at an angle. One row of stitches did not match the others. It was newer, tighter, done by hand. Maya's breath changed. She looked around the diner. The waitress was refilling coffee at the counter. A man in a hoodie slept with his head against the window. No one was watching. Maya took a spoon from the table and slid the handle beneath the lining. She worked slowly, afraid of tearing whatever might be hidden inside. The stitches resisted, then loosened one by one. When the leather finally opened, something small and metallic slipped into her palm. A silver key. It was narrow, clean, and heavier than it looked. Not a house key, not a car key. The edge was cut in an unusual pattern, and one side had a tiny serial number etched near the head. Behind it was a folded piece of paper. Maya opened it with trembling fingers. On one side were coordinates. On the other side, in her father's unmistakable handwriting, were 3 lines for Maya. Light always waits inside the dark. Trust no one until the truth has a witness. Maya read the note again and again. The diner noise faded until all she could hear was the rain tapping the glass. Her father had written this before he died. He had hidden it where only she might think to look. He had left coordinates, a key, and a warning. That meant Charles had known something was wrong. It meant he had been afraid. And it meant Victoria's story about a sudden heart attack repeated to board members and reporters and friends with a grieving wife's controlled sadness might not be the truth at all. Maya did not sleep that night. She used the diner's weak internet to search the coordinates. They pointed to a stretch of Nevada desert far from any major town, near the remains of an old mining settlement that had not appeared in recent travel guides. There were grainy satellite images of dirt roads, pale roofs, and a long abandoned service yard. No company listing, no public records that made sense, no obvious reason Charles Carter, a black tech founder from San Francisco, would have left his daughter a key to a forgotten place under a hard desert sun. But Maya knew one thing. Victoria had thrown her out, expecting her to disappear into grief. Instead, she had handed Maya the only thing in the house she had underestimated. By sunrise, Maya had counted the cash in her wallet 3 times. It was not enough for a hotel. It was barely enough for food and a bus ticket. Her bank card still worked, but she did not trust it. If Victoria had control over the estate, she might have access to more than Maya understood. Cards left trails. Phones left trails. Even grief left trails when powerful people wanted to follow it. So Maya made a decision that felt reckless and necessary at the same time. She bought a bus ticket with cash. Before boarding, she turned off her phone, removed the card, and slipped it into the lining of her shoe. Then she carried the camera bag onto the bus and sat by the window, watching San Francisco fall away behind gray morning glass. The journey took most of the day. At first, the world outside was familiar. Freeways, warehouses, gas stations, The long, ordinary sprawl of California moving past in strips of concrete and billboard light. Then the land opened. The color changed. Green thinned into brown. The sky grew larger. The air outside the bus windows seemed to sharpen. Maya tried to rest, but each time she closed her eyes, she saw her father in the casket, too still to be the man who used to fill rooms without raising his voice. She remembered the last month of his life, the way he had rubbed his chest when he thought no one saw, the new fatigue in his face. Victoria standing beside him with a glass of water and a pill organizer, telling him he was working too hard, telling Maya not to upset him with questions. At the time, Maya had believed it was illness. Now every tender gesture looked different in memory. That was the first cruel gift of suspicion. It did not only point forward, it went backward, touching every scene you thought you understood and turning it in your hand until the light caught a hidden edge. Maya got off the bus in a small Nevada town where the station was also a convenience store and the air smelled like dust, gasoline, and hot rubber. She bought bottled water, crackers, and a paper map because the coordinates led beyond reliable signal. With almost the last of her cash, she rented an old sedan from a local garage where the owner cared more about a deposit than her story. The car's air conditioning coughed more than it cooled. The road out of town narrowed quickly. Pavement gave way to patched asphalt, then to a washboard dirt road that shook the steering wheel under her hands. The desert stretched on both sides, in low scrub and pale stone. Mountains rose in the distance, dark and blunt, against the open sky. There were no houses, no stores, no easy place to turn around. Maya felt fear, then plain and physical, not the sharp fear of Victoria at the door. This was older, quieter. The fear of realizing that no one knew where you were, that your father had sent you into emptiness with a key, and that the only way to honor him was to keep going. She almost stopped twice. The first time when her phone showed no signal at all. The second time when she reached the remains of the mining town and saw how dead it looked. The settlement sat in a shallow basin between red-brown hills. A row of wooden storefronts leaned under the weight of years. A faded sign swung above what had once been a general store. A church with no bell stood at the end of the main road, its windows boarded, its steps half covered in sand. Wind moved through loose metal and made the whole place seem to breathe. Maya parked beside an old mechanic's shop on the far edge of town. It looked like the least important building there. The roof was rusted, the windows were broken. A sun-bleached sign over the door still showed the ghost of painted letters, but the words were unreadable. Old tires sat stacked against one wall, their rubber cracked from heat. If Maya had passed it without the coordinates, she would never have slowed down. But the front door was wrong. Everything around it was decaying, but the door itself was steel, thick, modern, set inside a reinforced frame, and the lock was almost new. Maya took out the silver key. Her hand shook so badly that it took 2 tries to fit it into the lock. When it finally slid in, the sound was soft and exact. The key turned. For a moment, Maya simply stood there with her palm against the hot metal door. Then she pulled it open. Cool air met her face. Not natural coolness, mechanical air, filtered, alive. Inside the shop looked abandoned at first. Dusty tools, a cracked workbench, rusted engine parts, shelves crowded with old cans and bent metal. Sunlight entered through broken windows in thin, dirty beams. The place smelled like oil dust and old iron. Maya closed the door behind her and listened. There was a hum, very faint, not from the room around her, but from below. She moved slowly, using the flashlight from her phone, even though she knew she needed to save battery. The beam passed over tool cabinets, a collapsed chair, a faded calendar from years before she was born. She searched drawers, tapped walls, lifted tarps, and found nothing but dust. For nearly an hour, the hidden place remained hidden. Frustration rose in her chest. She wondered if she had misunderstood everything. Maybe the key had been planted. Maybe the coordinates were meant to trap her. Maybe grief had turned a few strange details into a story because the alternative that her father was simply gone and Victoria had won was too empty to bear. Then her flashlight caught a mark on the floor. It was behind a heavy metal shelf pushed against the rear wall. A long scrape curved through the dust, too clean to be old. The shelf had been moved before, more than once. Maya remembered the line on the note, "Light always waits inside the dark." She put both hands on the shelf and pushed. At first, nothing happened. The shelf was heavier than it looked, and the old metal bit into her palms. She braced one foot against the concrete and tried again. The shelf shifted with a low grinding sound that made her freeze and listen. No one came. She pushed until a narrow panel appeared in the wall behind it. There was no handle, only a small black switch set into the concrete, hidden where no casual intruder would ever see it. Maya pressed it. For 1 second, the shop was silent. Then something beneath the floor unlocked. A rectangular section of concrete slid sideways with a controlled mechanical groan, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. Maya stepped back, heart hammering. Her father had not left her a clue. He had left her a fortress. The stairwell lights came on one by one as she descended. The air grew colder. The walls changed from rough concrete to reinforced panels. At the bottom was a short corridor, a second steel door, and a keypad that did not ask for a code, because the silver key opened it too. Beyond that door was a room no one would have believed existed beneath the dead mechanic's shop. It was not large, but it was complete. There were servers and temperature-controlled cabinets, a desk with 2 monitors, file drawers, a radio unit, water storage, medical supplies, and a narrow cot folded against the wall. The equipment was clean, maintained, waiting. On the desk sat a framed photograph. Charles Carter, younger and smiling, held Maya on his shoulders at a beach. Maya must have been 4. Her small hands were in his hair. Her mouth was open in laughter. Charles looked up at her as if the whole world had narrowed to the weight of his daughter above him. Beneath the frame was another note. "You are the reason I prepared for the day I prayed would never come." Maya sat down so suddenly that the chair rolled back against the desk. That was when she cried. Not loudly. Not the way people cried in movies. The sound that came from her was broken and small. The sound of someone trying not to fall apart because there was still work to do. She pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth and let grief pass through her in waves. For months, people had told her Charles was gone. But down here in this hidden room, she felt him everywhere. In the labels on the drawers, in the backup batteries dated by hand, in the water bottles rotated by expiration, in the photograph, in the key, in the fact that even while he was being cornered by something he feared, he had thought of her future before his own fear. When the crying eased, Maya began to search. The file drawers held property deeds under company names she had never heard, emergency cash, copies of identification documents, legal envelopes, a sealed packet labeled with her name. But the center of the room was a fireproof safe built into the wall, its keypad dark until she touched it. Maya tried her birthday. Nothing. Her father's birthday. Nothing. Her mother's birthday. The date Carter Dynamics was founded. The day Charles took the company public. The old code he used when Maya was little. Nothing. She stepped away, breathing hard. Charles would not choose a number Victoria could guess. He would choose something that required attention. Something Maya had, but only if she looked closely. Her eyes went to the key, the tiny serial number etched near the head. She wrote it down. Then she thought of the founding date of Carter Dynamics, the one Charles made her memorize, because he said every family should know the day its second child was born. She combined the numbers hesitated, and entered them. The safe beeped once, the lock released. Inside were gold bars, bundles of cash, backup drives, sealed legal documents, and a black hard drive inside a fireproof case. Maya ignored the gold. That, more than anything, would have made her father proud. She connected the hard drive to the computer. The first folder opened to a simple title, "If Maya Finds This." Inside was a video file. Maya clicked it. Charles appeared on the screen in his study, wearing the navy sweater he used to put on when he had been working too long. He looked thinner than she remembered, tired. His skin had a gray undertone, and his eyes carried the strain of a man trying to speak calmly while time moved against him. He did not waste words. He told Maya that if she was watching, he had failed to bring the truth into the open himself. He told her he loved her. He told her that grief would make her want to trust the first person who sounded certain, but certainty was not the same as truth. Then he told her to open the evidence folder. Maya paused the video twice because her hands were shaking too hard to use the mouse. The evidence folder was enormous. At first, she did not understand most of it. Spreadsheets, scanned contracts, pension fund reports, vendor invoices, bank routing records, internal emails, security logs, medical documents, names of shell companies, names of trustees, dates highlighted in yellow, notes in Charles's careful hand. But as Maya moved through the files, the shape of the crime emerged. Victoria had not simply wanted Charles's estate. She had been stealing long before he died. For years, money from Carter Dynamics' Employee Retirement Fund had been diverted through consulting contracts and real estate partnerships that looked legitimate from a distance. The names were ordinary enough to disappear in a crowded ledger. Meridian Growth, Ashwell Strategic, Briar Palm Holdings. Each company billed for advisory services, property research, market expansion, risk analysis. The invoices used clean language and round numbers. The approvals appeared to come from busy executives who trusted Victoria because Charles trusted her. But Charles had noticed patterns. Payments that cleared just under review thresholds. Vendors with mailing addresses that led to shared office suites. Board packets where supporting documents were replaced at the last minute. Retirement fund transfers that moved through 2 accounts, then vanished into property purchases in other states, and offshore accounts hidden behind layers of ownership. Charles had been building a case quietly, carefully. Not because he cared about looking betrayed, but because the money belonged to employees who had trusted his name. Engineers, janitors, assistants, drivers, cafeteria workers, people who had given years of labor to Carter Dynamics because Charles promised the company would take care of the people who helped build it. Victoria had taken from all of them, and when Charles began to close in, his health changed. Maya opened the medical folder and felt the room tilt. There were pharmacy records, lab reports, private toxicology notes from an independent doctor, a scanned image of Charles's prescription schedule. Then, security footage from the hallway outside his home office. Maya watched Victoria enter the office when Charles was not there. The timestamp was from 6 weeks before his death. Victoria wore a pale silk blouse and moved with the calm efficiency of someone doing a task she had done before. She opened the drawer where Charles kept his medication. She removed a bottle. She replaced several pills with others from a smaller container in her purse. Maya stopped the video. For a moment, her mind refused to go where the evidence pointed. She stood up, walked away from the desk, pressed both hands against the cold wall. Her father's last weeks returned in fragments. Victoria bringing him tea. Victoria insisting he take his medicine. Victoria telling Maya he needed rest. Victoria touching his shoulder in front of guests with a tenderness that now looked like possession. Maya made herself watch the rest. The independent report was clinical and merciless. The substituted medication could aggravate heart rhythm problems when taken over time, especially in a patient under stress. It would not look like poison to someone who is not looking. It would look like decline. It would look like a weak heart giving up. Charles Carter's heart had not given up. It had been betrayed. Maya bent forward in the chair, one hand gripping the edge of the desk, and the grief inside her changed shape. It became anger. Not wild anger. Not the kind that burns through judgment. This was colder, sharper. It gave her the strength to keep opening files. The final folder was labeled Will. Inside were drafts, signature comparisons, metadata reports, and a statement from a forensic document examiner Charles had contacted before he died. The will Victoria presented had been assembled after Charles's death from scanned pages and copied signatures. The witnesses were connected to one of Victoria's shell companies. One had been paid through a consulting invoice 2 days before the will appeared. Maya understood then why Victoria had been in such a hurry to remove her. As long as Maya was grieving, isolated, and broke, she was easier to dismiss. As long as she looked like an angry daughter questioning a widow, no one powerful had to listen. But Charles had known that too. He had prepared proof that did not depend on anyone's sympathy. Maya copied the files to a second drive from the safe, then searched for a way to transmit them. The bunker had a satellite unit, but the instructions were dense, and every minute in that room made her more aware of how alone she was. She had just found evidence of murder, fraud, forgery, and a stolen company. Victoria had already taken the house. She had taken the will. If she learned where Maya was, she would not stop at taking the evidence. A sound came from above. It was faint, but in the bunker it landed like a gunshot. Metal shifting. Then a footstep. Maya froze. She turned off the monitor and grabbed the first thing within reach, a heavy flashlight from the emergency shelf. She moved to the side of the stairwell and held her breath. The footsteps came closer, slow, measured. Someone descended the stairs. A tall black man appeared at the bottom, with both hands visible. He was in his early 50s, broad through the shoulders, with close-cropped gray hair and a scar along one eyebrow. He did not look surprised to see Maya holding the flashlight like a weapon. He said her name softly. Maya raised the flashlight higher. He introduced himself as Marcus Reed. The name meant nothing to her at first. Then he told her he had once been a police detective. Years earlier, before Charles became famous enough to be surrounded by private security, Marcus had investigated a kidnapping attempt involving a former contractor. The case brought him into Charles's life. Later, Charles hired him quietly, not as a bodyguard for photographs, but as someone who understood threats people hid behind paperwork. Maya did not lower the flashlight. Her father's note had been clear. Trust no one until the truth has a witness. Marcus seemed to expect that. He did not step toward her. He placed a small drive on the table and told her Charles had recorded something for this moment. Maya waited until he backed away before she touched it. The video opened with Charles in the same sweater, but this time his eyes looked directly into hers. He told Maya that Marcus knew the full plan. He told her Marcus was not there to make decisions for her. He was there to make sure she lived long enough to make them herself. Then Charles looked down for a second, and the mask of control slipped. He said he was sorry, not for the money, not for the company, for the loneliness his precautions might leave behind, for the fact that the daughter he had tried to protect might have to discover the truth in a room beneath the desert instead of hearing it from his own mouth. Maya covered her mouth and closed her eyes. When she opened them again, Marcus was watching the security monitor. His expression had changed. Maya followed his gaze. On the screen, 3 black SUVs moved along the dirt road toward the mechanic's shop. Victoria had found them. The realization did not come with surprise. It came with a sick kind of clarity. Maya had used her phone before removing the card. She had rented a car. She had been exhausted grieving and untrained in the habits of people who lived by hiding. Somewhere, somehow, she had left enough of a trail. Marcus moved quickly now. He told Maya that Charles had suspected Victoria knew about a desert property, though not its exact location. She must have been watching for any movement after Maya left the house. A card inquiry, a rental record, a traffic camera, a hired investigator. People like Victoria did not need to know everything if they could afford enough people to fill in the gaps. Maya asked if they could leave through the tunnels. Marcus said yes, but not yet. The evidence had to get out first. He connected the hard drive to the satellite unit and began a secure transfer to federal contacts Charles had prepared months earlier. Not a vague emergency call, not a desperate message into the void. A documented evidence package addressed to agents already aware that Carter Dynamics was under suspicious financial pressure. Agents who had never received the final testimony because Charles died before the meeting. The progress bar appeared on the screen. 3%. 5. 8. Above them, the steel door opened. Victoria entered the shop with 4 armed men. Maya could see them on the security monitor. Victoria wore a cream-colored suit, spotless even in the desert, her hair smooth, her face composed. She looked less like a grieving widow than a woman arriving to inspect property she believed she already owned. The men with her moved like hired force, no wasted gestures, no curiosity. Their presence stripped away the last polite version of Victoria's story. Marcus handed Maya a small recorder and clipped a second device beneath the desk. He did not give a speech. He simply told her that if Victoria came down, Maya needed to keep her talking. Maya almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because 24 hours earlier she had been standing in the rain with a broken suitcase, and now she was being asked to stall the woman who may have murdered her father, while a satellite uplink crawled toward justice. The bunker door opened. Victoria descended first. She looked around the room, and for the first time since Maya had known her, something like genuine emotion crossed her face. Not guilt, recognition. Charles had kept something from her. That wounded her pride more than his death ever had. Victoria's gaze landed on the open safe, the hard drive, the monitors, and finally on Maya. She told Maya she had always been too much like Charles, smart enough to find a door, sentimental enough to stand in front of it instead of running. Maya wanted to scream at her. She wanted to say her father's name in a way that would tear the room open. But she thought of the progress bar behind Marcus. 26%. She made her voice small instead. She asked Victoria why. Not with accusation, with disbelief. With the voice of a daughter who still wanted one human answer from the woman who had helped bury her father. Victoria studied her, then smiled as if Maya had finally asked the right question. People like Victoria rarely confess because they feel guilt. They confess when they think the listener is already defeated. They confess when pride becomes stronger than caution. She did not give the whole truth at once. It came in fragments, wrapped in old resentment. She said Charles had loved being admired for building something alone, even though she had polished his image and opened doors he was too proud to notice. She said donors took her calls, investors listened because she softened his edges, board members trusted his vision because she made it look graceful. She said she stood beside him for 6 years while everyone called her lucky to have his name. Maya listened. The progress bar reached 41%. Victoria said Charles was going to ruin everything over accounting. Accounting. That was the word she used for stolen retirements, shell companies, forged approvals, and lives that could have been destroyed years later when workers discovered the safety they counted on had been hollowed out. Maya asked if he knew about the pills. Victoria's face hardened. For the first time, the mask slipped enough to show the contempt beneath it. She said Charles had a weak heart. She said stress did what stress does. She said replacing medication was not the same as putting a knife in someone's hand. But then Maya said the doctor's report was in the safe. Victoria looked toward the open door of the safe. That glance was enough. Then Maya said the security footage was there too. Victoria's composure cracked. She stepped closer and told Maya that Charles should have stopped digging. He should have signed the revised structure, let the old accounts settle, and accepted that a company that large did not stay clean by accident. He should have understood that loyalty meant protecting the person beside him, not sacrificing her to investigators over money employees would never even know was missing until they were too old to fight. Maya felt sick. Not because Victoria sounded monstrous, because she sounded practical. That was the horror of it. She had turned betrayal into management. She had turned murder into risk control. She had turned other people's futures into numbers that could be moved around until no one remembered where they started. Behind her, the upload reached 68%. One of Victoria's men noticed Marcus's hand near the satellite unit. The room changed instantly. The quiet became dangerous. Victoria looked from Marcus to the screen and understood enough. Her voice dropped. She ordered the men to destroy the equipment. Then she looked at Maya and said the desert was full of places no one checked anymore. Marcus moved first. He hit a switch beneath the desk, and the bunker went dark. Not completely. A low red emergency light came on along the floor, just enough to turn bodies into shadows and edges into threats. Maya felt Marcus pull her behind a reinforced wall as shouting filled the room. A gunshot cracked through the dark and struck metal. Sparks jumped from a server cabinet. Someone cursed. Another shot hit concrete. Maya covered her ears, then forced her hands down because she needed to move. Marcus guided her through a side passage she had not seen before. The bunker was not one room after all. It was a network. Charles had built exits, blind corners, reinforced doors, and communication lines that did not reveal themselves until the emergency system woke them. The upload continued from a protected unit behind the wall. 83%. Maya could not see the number, but Marcus whispered it as they moved. Victoria's men entered the passage. Marcus sealed a door between them with a manual lever. Metal slammed into place just as another shot rang out. The sound hit the sealed door and died there. For several minutes, time lost shape. There was only red light concrete breath, and the knowledge that somewhere beyond the walls, Victoria was tearing through her father's last act of protection. Then Maya heard something from beneath them. Not gunfire. Engines. Heavy boots. Voices amplified by radios. Marcus closed his eyes for half a second, and the relief on his face told Maya before the words did. The federal team had reached the tunnels. Charles had not counted on a miracle. He had counted on preparation. Months earlier, Marcus had mapped the emergency access routes for federal agents in case Charles could not make his scheduled disclosure. When Marcus sent the alert, it included coordinates, tunnel entry points, and the live evidence transfer. The agents had already been monitoring Victoria's known associates after suspicious movements around the estate. Her own decision to chase Maya into the desert tightened the net around her. The raid came from below and behind. Victoria had expected one staircase. She did not expect the hidden service tunnel beneath the old church. She did not expect agents entering through the dry drainage line outside the settlement. She did not expect the dead town to have more doors than the living house she had stolen. The first command echoed through the bunker with such force that everyone stopped. Federal agents flooded the corridor. The armed men were forced down, disarmed, and cuffed. One tried to run toward the stairs and found another team waiting above. Marcus stepped out with his hands visible, identifying himself, while Maya stayed behind the concrete wall until an agent called her name. Victoria did not run at first. She stood very still near the desk, one hand resting on the edge, as if she could still claim the room by touching it. Then she saw the progress bar. Complete. The evidence package had transmitted. So had the audio from the recorder under Maya's jacket. Victoria looked at Maya then, and the hatred in her face was no longer hidden beneath manners. It was raw, personal, almost childish in its refusal to accept consequence. She asked Maya if she thought taking back the company meant she had won. Maya wanted to answer with anger. She wanted to name every stolen thing, every pill, every forged signature, every cold word on the porch. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was quieter. She told Victoria that winning had begun the moment Victoria failed to make her disappear. That was all. It was enough. The agents led Victoria away in handcuffs. Outside, dawn had started to touch the edges of the desert. Maya emerged from the mechanic's shop, wrapped in a federal jacket, the camera bag pressed against her chest. The settlement looked different in the early light. Still broken, still abandoned, but not empty anymore. Vehicles lined the dirt road. Agents moved in and out of the buildings. Evidence tags fluttered in the wind. A place Victoria thought would hide a crime had become the place where the crime finally learned its own name. Maya stood beside Marcus and watched the sun rise behind the rusted roof. She did not feel victorious. Not yet. She felt exhausted, hollowed out, older than she had been 2 days earlier. The truth had not brought her father back. It had not erased the image of Victoria opening his medication drawer. It had not undone the rain on the front steps or the way the porch light shut off above her. Truth was not comfort, but it was ground. And for the first time since Charles died, Maya had somewhere solid to stand. The investigation that followed moved through the world Victoria had built, like light through a cracked wall. At first, the public story was careful. Federal authorities executed search warrants connected to financial misconduct at Carter Dynamics. The board released a statement expressing cooperation. Reporters gathered outside the headquarters with microphones and polished urgency. People who had smiled beside Victoria at charity events suddenly spoke of her with cautious distance. But documents have a way of outlasting charm. The pension fund theft became undeniable. Forensic accountants traced the money through shell companies, property purchases, consulting invoices, and accounts Victoria believed were buried too deeply to reach. The forged will collapsed under metadata, witness payments, signature analysis, and the simple fact that Charles had recorded his fears before the document ever appeared. Then the medical evidence reopened Charles Carter's death. That changed everything. The story was no longer about a family dispute or corporate fraud. It was about a black founder who had built one of the most respected technology firms in California, discovered that his own wife was stealing from the people who trusted him, and died after his medication was secretly altered. Maya was called to testify before she was ready. No one is ready to describe a parent's murder in a room full of strangers. Still, she went. She wore a dark blue suit that had belonged to no one powerful, carried her father's camera bag instead of a designer briefcase, and sat before attorneys who tried to turn grief into confusion. Victoria's defense suggested Maya was traumatized, angry, manipulated by Marcus, eager to inherit. They asked why Charles had not gone directly to police. They asked why Maya had traveled alone. They asked whether she understood the financial documents herself. Maya answered what she knew. When she did not know, she said so. That honesty did more than any performance could have. Marcus testified too. So did federal agents, accountants, doctors, document experts, former employees, and one retired administrative assistant who remembered Victoria demanding access to Charles's medication drawer under the excuse of helping him manage stress. The trial lasted weeks. Victoria arrived each day dressed as if the courtroom were another gala. Perfect suits, controlled expression, no visible fear. But the evidence narrowed around her. The recordings, the transfers, the forged will, the footage, the pill substitutions, the hired men in the desert. Each piece removed another layer of the woman she had performed in public. In the end, the jury did not convict Victoria because Maya cried. They convicted her because Charles had prepared, because Marcus had witnessed, because records had memory, and because the truth had finally been given enough light to be seen. Victoria Carter was found guilty of murder, financial fraud, money laundering, forgery, conspiracy, and attempted witness intimidation. The sentence was life in prison with additional federal penalties tied to the financial crimes. When the verdict was read, Maya did not smile. She closed her eyes. For one breath, she was back in the diner, with cold coffee in front of her and the silver key in her palm. Then she opened her eyes and let the moment pass through her without letting it harden her. That became the real work, because winning the case was not the same as rebuilding a life. After the will was voided, Maya was recognized as Charles Carter's rightful heir. Carter Dynamics came back under her control through trusts and board authority Charles had established before the forged document. Overnight, people who had ignored her calls wanted meetings. Reporters wanted interviews. Board members who had once treated her like a grieving child spoke carefully around her, measuring each word for signs of the leader she might become. Maya could have walked into headquarters and ruled by injury. She did not. She was 20 years old. She knew what she did not know. So her first act was not a speech about legacy. It was an audit. An independent one. Every pension account, every vendor relationship, every executive approval process, every board exception Victoria had touched. Maya brought in outside counsel, forensic accountants, worker representatives, and ethics advisors who had no reason to flatter the Carter name. She opened records that embarrassed the company because she understood something Victoria never had. A reputation protected by silence is not integrity. It is a locked room. The money stolen from the retirement fund was restored with interest using recovered assets insurance claims, forfeited accounts, and estate holdings Victoria had tried to hide. Employees received letters written in plain language, not corporate fog, explaining what had happened, what had been repaired, and what safeguards would now exist. Maya insisted that cafeteria staff, maintenance workers, drivers, assistants, engineers, and executives receive the same explanation. The theft had not respected rank. The repair would not either. Some board members resisted. They warned that too much transparency would damage confidence. Maya thought of the bunker. She thought of the line her father had written, "Light always waits inside the dark." Then she told them confidence built on darkness had nearly killed the company already. That meeting became the first time people at Carter Dynamics saw more than Charles's daughter. They saw a young black woman carrying grief, yes, but also carrying judgment. Not loud, not theatrical, steady. In time, Maya returned to the mansion. The first visit was harder than the verdict. The house had been cleaned after investigators finished. The foyer gleamed. The staircase curved upward with the same quiet arrogance. Her father's study had evidence tape residue on one drawer. Victoria's clothes were gone, but her perfume seemed to linger in the walls. Or maybe that was just memory being cruel. Maya stood on the front steps for a long time before entering. This was the place where she had learned to ride a bicycle, in the driveway. The place where Charles measured her height on the inside of the pantry door until Victoria had the marks painted over. The place where Denise's photographs watched over birthdays, holidays, late homework, and ordinary mornings that Maya had not known to cherish enough. It was also the place where Victoria closed the door on her. Maya knew she could live there again. People expected her to. It was hers by law and memory. But law and healing are not always the same thing. So Maya made a different choice. She turned the Carter Mansion into a transitional home and legal support center for young people who had been pushed out, orphaned, manipulated, or left without safe family. Not a charity wing for photographs, not a plaque on a wall, a real place with bedrooms, counselors, financial literacy classes, grief support, emergency legal help, and staff trained to understand that being young and abandoned does not mean being irresponsible. The first night the center opened, Maya walked through the house after everyone else had left. The dining room where Victoria once hosted donors now held long tables where residents could eat without being watched, like guests who might steal silver. The library where Charles used to take calls became a quiet study room. The room that had once been Maya's became a bedroom for another young woman who arrived with 2 bags, red eyes, and nowhere else to go. Maya stood in the doorway and felt something inside her loosen. Victoria had tried to turn exile into shame. Maya turned the house into shelter. The gold and emergency cash from the Nevada safe became the first funding for the Charles Carter Foundation. Its mission was narrow enough to be useful and broad enough to honor him, protect vulnerable young adults from financial abuse, family abandonment, and legal erasure. The foundation paid for emergency housing, document recovery education grants, and attorneys for those who had been cut out of inheritances, accounts, or homes by people who counted on their silence. Marcus Reed became the foundation's director of security and investigations. He did not like ceremonies, but Maya made him attend the opening. He stood at the back in a dark suit, arms folded, looking uncomfortable when people applauded. Later, when the crowd had thinned, he admitted that Charles would have liked the place. Maya asked if he was sure. Marcus looked toward the staircase and said, "Charles did not build safe rooms because he loved hiding. He built them because he believed someone should survive long enough to open the door." Maya kept the camera bag in her office, not behind glass at first. She kept it on a shelf within reach, the leather still worn, the hidden seam repaired, but visible if you knew where to look. Some days she touched it before difficult meetings. Some days she avoided looking at it because the grief was too fresh. Over time, it became less like a wound and more like a witness. Years passed, not in a montage of easy triumph, but in the slow way real healing moves. Maya made mistakes at Carter Dynamics. She trusted one consultant too quickly and corrected it. She cried in bathrooms between meetings and then went back in. She learned the difference between people who respected her leadership and people who respected her last name. She hired slowly, fired carefully, asked questions her father might not have asked because she was not Charles, and the company did not need her to become him. That was one of the hardest truths. Loving her father did not mean copying him. His secrecy had saved her, but it had also left her alone with too many locked doors. So Maya built systems that did not depend on one brilliant man hiding evidence in the desert. Whistleblower protections, independent oversight, shared authority, employee seats on ethics committees, clear reporting lines that reached outside executive control. The company became less glamorous in some ways. It also became stronger. People learned that the Carter name no longer meant one founder's genius. It meant a promise that no worker's future could be treated as spare money for someone else's ambition. At the foundation, Maya heard stories that reminded her why the work mattered. A student whose aunt had taken settlement money meant for college. A young man locked out by relatives after his grandmother died. A sister trying to recover documents from a stepfather who insisted she had no rights because she had no money to fight him. Not every case ended cleanly. Not every wrong could be undone. But every person who walked through the door was met with a chair, a meal, a name spoken correctly, and someone willing to look at the paperwork. That became Maya's quiet answer to Victoria. Not revenge repeated daily. Repair repeated daily. On the 5th anniversary of Victoria's conviction, Maya returned to the Nevada mining town. She went alone at first, though Marcus knew exactly where she was, and had argued against the alone part until she promised 3 check-ins and a satellite tracker. The old sedan had been replaced by a foundation vehicle with better tires and air conditioning that actually worked, but the road still shook beneath her. The same mountains held the horizon. The same hard light fell across the scrub. The town looked smaller than memory, but the mechanic's shop still stood at the edge of it, with its rusted roof and steel door. Maya carried the silver key. She had not needed it for years. The locks had been updated, the site secured, the tunnels mapped and reinforced. But she brought it because some objects do not stop mattering just because they are no longer necessary. Inside the shop had been stabilized but not beautified. Maya had refused to turn it into a museum polished beyond recognition. The rusted tools remained on one wall. The old workbench had been cleaned but not replaced. A visitor could still see what the place had pretended to be. Then the hidden stairwell opened. The bunker below had changed. It no longer stored gold cash or emergency passports. The servers had been replaced. The cot was gone. The walls held secure archives, case files, oral histories, and exhibits about financial abuse, corporate accountability, and family betrayal disguised as legal procedure. There were photographs of people the foundation had helped, not displayed as trophies, but with permission and dignity. There were records of whistleblowers, caretakers, assistants, and overlooked workers whose attention had saved others from harm. Maya stood in the center of the room where she had once learned how her father died. For a long time she said nothing. Then she took the folded note from her pocket. The original paper had been preserved in a protective sleeve, but she carried a copy with her. Charles's handwriting still had the power to pull the air from her lungs. Light always waits inside the dark. When she first read those words, she thought they meant the bunker. Then she thought they meant evidence. Now she understood them differently. The darkness was not only the place beneath the desert. It was the hour after the door closed. It was the diner booth. It was the courtroom. It was the first board meeting where men twice her age waited for her to prove she had a right to speak. It was every young person who arrived at the foundation believing abandonment had made them disposable. And the light was not magic. It was a key hidden where love remembered to put it. It was a witness willing to wait. It was a record no lie could charm. It was the choice to build shelter from the house where you were once rejected. Before leaving, Maya placed a new photograph on the bunker desk. It showed the front steps of the Carter mansion on opening day of the foundation. Young people, staff attorneys, counselors, and volunteers filled the frame. Marcus stood off to one side, looking serious as always. Maya stood near the center, not in front of everyone, but among them. Beneath the photograph, she added a small plaque. For Charles Carter, who prepared a door. For every person still searching for the key. When Maya stepped back into the desert sun, the wind was warm against her face. The old town no longer felt like a graveyard. It felt like a warning and a promise at the same time. Some places are built to hide what powerful people do in the dark. But sometimes, if one person keeps walking, if one small key survives, if one daughter refuses to let grief make her obedient, that same darkness becomes the place where the truth finally turns on the light. And if you were Maya, standing in the rain on your 20th birthday, with nothing but a broken bag and your father's old camera case, would you have followed the coordinates into the desert? Would you have opened the door? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you believe the truth can be delayed, buried, mocked, and locked away, but still find its way back into the hands of the person brave enough to carry it, then like this video, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs to remember that losing everything is not always the end. Sometimes it is the moment the hidden key finally reaches your hand.
You only saw value after witnesses arrived.
You still need capital, Grace.
No, I am ending yours.
You are making a mistake. My grandfather saw this field before you could price it. This is not over.
If this field fails tomorrow, they take everything. Grandpa, let the work speak now.
A few green rows do not make a farm.
Keep moving.
There it is.
No one calls it dead now.
We weigh every row.
It actually grew.
This changes the review.
One potato changes nothing.
This is proof.
Then show us all of it.
The first potato Grace Carter pulled from the soil was not large enough to save a farm by itself. It fit in her palm, dusty and pale gold, with a thin curl of root still clinging to one side. It looked ordinary, almost too ordinary for the silence that fell over everyone standing at the edge of that field. But on that June morning in Montana, nobody laughed. Not the banker with the folded inspection form in his hand, not the state agriculture officer who had driven 2 hours across the plains to see whether the impossible had happened, not the neighbors who had come mostly because they expected to witness the final embarrassment of a young woman who had tried to argue with dead ground, and certainly not Miller, the wealthy rancher next door, who had spent years telling anyone who would listen that the west side of the Carter farm was useless. For a few seconds, Grace only stared at the potato in her palm. Her jeans were muddy, her wrists were scratched, her shoulders ached from weeks of work that had nearly broken her. Behind her, the old tractor idled with a rough, uneven sound like it was trying to catch its breath, too. Then the blade turned another strip of soil. More potatoes rolled into the light. One after another, they came up from a piece of land that people in that county had called dead for longer than Grace had been alive. And that was when Grace understood something she had not fully allowed herself to believe until that exact moment. Her grandfather had not left her a failing farm. He had left her proof. To understand why that mattered and why one field of potatoes could make a rich man lose the thing he had wanted for nearly 20 years, you have to go back 69 days. Grace Carter returned to Montana in the spring of 2023 with one black suitcase, one pressed funeral dress, and a guilt she had been carrying so long it had become familiar. She was 29 years old, a quality control inspector for an agricultural distributor in Denver, and by every practical measure, she had built the kind of life her grandfather had once told her to chase. She had a steady paycheck. She had an apartment with working heat. She had a job that used her degree. She knew how to read lab reports, trace supply chains, and spot problems in produce lots before they turned into expensive recalls. But none of that knowledge helped her when she stepped into the old Carter farmhouse after the funeral and saw the stack of bank papers waiting on the kitchen table. The house smelled the way it always had, like old wood, black coffee machine oil, and the faint, clean dust that blows through homes on the plains, no matter how often someone sweeps. Her grandfather's work jacket still hung on the peg by the back door. His cap still sat on the shelf above it, brim bent, sweat darkened, familiar enough that for one painful second, Grace expected him to come in from the yard and ask why she was standing there like a stranger. Instead, there was only paper, a loan statement, a foreclosure warning, a notice from the bank stating that the Carter farm had 69 days left before the debt would move into enforcement. The amount was $31,400. It was not a millionaire's number. That almost made it worse. It was not so large that it sounded impossible in an abstract way. It was close enough to imagine, close enough to haunt her. Grace could see the number and picture every failed attempt to reach it. A second job, a personal loan, selling the remaining cattle, scraping together old equipment and hoping some buyer wanted rust more than parts. It was a number that looked almost reachable until she remembered the farm's condition, the repairs, the empty accounts, the deadlines already missed before she ever came home. Her grandfather, Elias Carter, had left her 44 acres. He had also left her a clock. The banker had been polite on the phone, which made the conversation feel colder. The estate had transferred to her, yes. The bank understood that bereavement complicated matters, yes. But the farm had been underperforming for years. The western acreage was listed as non-productive. The equipment was old. Livestock income had declined. Unless Grace paid the overdue balance, refinanced with sufficient collateral, or proved that the farm had realistic income potential, the bank would proceed. Grace asked him what realistic meant. He paused just long enough for her to hear the answer before he said it. It meant numbers. It meant proof. It meant more than sentiment. Grace stood in the kitchen after the call ended, staring at the worn place on the floor, where her grandfather's boots had rubbed the boards pale over decades. She had spent much of her childhood in that house. Her mother had worked long hospital shifts in Billings when Grace was small, and summers belonged to Elias. He taught Grace how to test melons by weight, how to smell rain before it reached the valley, how to stand still around nervous horses, and how to fix a fence staple without hitting her thumb. He was not a man who talked about feelings directly. He showed love by sharpening tools before you needed them, filling the truck before a storm, and cutting the last piece of cornbread in half without asking who wanted it. Grace loved him. She had also left him, not cruelly, not all at once. She had gone to college, then to Denver, then into work that demanded long hours and rewarded people who never looked back too closely. At first, she came home for holidays, then only for Christmas every other year. Then phone calls replaced visits. Then even the phone calls became shorter, squeezed between inspections and traffic and the tired little routines of adult life. Elias never complained. That might have hurt her more than complaint would have. He would ask about her job. He would tell her the weather. He would mention a tractor problem as if it were a neighbor with a stubborn personality. And when Grace said she would come soon, he would say, "The farm will be here." Now the farm was here. And he was not. 2 days after the funeral, when the last casserole dish had been returned and the last relative had driven away, a black pickup rolled slowly up the driveway. Grace knew the truck before she saw the driver. Miller owned the ranch along the north fence, plus 2 sections beyond it, plus enough influence in town that people said his name with a slight adjustment in their voices. His full name was Raymond Miller, but nobody called him Raymond unless they were selling him something. He was broad-shouldered, white-haired, and always dressed as if a camera might appear. Pressed jeans, clean boots, silver belt buckle, a smile that never reached any place it did not intend to use. When Grace was a child, Miller had seemed like part of the landscape, like the grain elevator or the windbreak cottonwoods. He was always there, standing near auction pens, talking at the feed store, speaking over people at county meetings. Elias had never trusted him. Whenever Miller's truck slowed along the Carter fence, Elias would grow quiet. That afternoon, Miller walked into the kitchen without asking if Grace wanted company. He held a folder in one hand. He offered condolences first. The words were correct, but thin. Then he looked around the kitchen, not with grief, not even with curiosity, but with measurement. His eyes moved from the cracked ceiling to the old stove, from the worn cabinets to the bank papers Grace had not had time to put away. He placed the folder on the table. Inside was a purchase agreement. It was not an offer so much as a verdict. The number was low, insultingly low. It treated the farm as if the only value left in it was the convenience of being next to Miller's land. Miller told Grace she was young, educated, and smart enough not to bury her life in someone else's stubbornness. He said Elias had been proud, but pride did not pay notes. He said the West acreage was dead and had been dead for years. He said banks did not care about family stories. Then he tapped the folder with 2 fingers and told her she could walk away clean. Clean, that word stayed with Grace, as if the farm were something dirty, as if the land her great-grandfather had bought after years of working other men's fields was an inconvenience she should rinse from her hands. The Carter farm was one of the few black-owned farms left in that part of the county. Grace knew the history in pieces because Elias had given it to her in pieces. Her great-grandfather, Jonah Carter, had come north with more nerve than money, working season by season, saving coins in jars, taking jobs nobody with better options wanted. He bought the first acres when people still laughed at the idea of a black family owning land out there. He paid too much because the seller knew he could. He signed papers under the watch of men who expected him to fail. But Jonah Carter did not fail. His son held it. Elias held it after that. Through bad winters, bad loans, cattle prices that fell at the worst possible time. Neighbors who helped quietly, and neighbors who smiled while waiting for the Carters to give up. To Miller, it was an underpriced piece of ground beside his empire. To Grace, even in her confusion and grief, it was more than dirt. She slid the folder back across the table and told him she was not selling a few days after burying her grandfather. Miller's smile shifted, not disappeared, shifted. The friendly layer thinned enough for her to see the hard thing under it. He told her that pride had a short shelf life when interest was running. Then he walked out. That evening, Grace took the bank papers and sat on the porch until the wind turned cold. To the east of the house, the usable fields lay brown but open, waiting for planting that would not bring money fast enough. To the south, the pasture rolled toward the creek bottom, where the remaining cattle moved like dark smudges in the last light. To the west lay the 6 acres everybody talked about in a lower voice, as if the land had a sickness that could hear its own name. The dead patch. That was what people called it. It did look dead. Even from a distance, the difference was visible. The soil was paler there, crusted in places, patched with hardpan, and thin gray streaks where salts had risen after wet years and stayed. The old resource extraction road beyond the ridge had changed drainage patterns decades ago. Runoff, compaction, and neglect had done the rest. Nothing useful grew there for long. Weeds came up, weak and yellow, then curled into themselves. Grass refused it. The land did not smell rich when it rained. It smelled sharp, mineral, exhausted. As a child, Grace had asked Elias why he did not sell that part off. He had said, "Because sick is not the same as dead." At 10 years old, she did not understand the difference. At 29, with a foreclosure deadline in her hands, she wanted desperately to believe he had. Over the next week, Grace began doing what practical people do when grief becomes too large to hold. She made lists. She opened drawers. She inventoried everything: cattle, fuel, feed, fencing, machinery, seed, tools, scrap metal, unpaid bills, old receipts. She tested water lines, checked gates, photographed equipment, and called 3 buyers about the smaller stock trailer. One offered her a price so low she laughed before she realized he was serious. The tractor was older than she was and had the temperament of a wounded animal. The irrigation line behind the lower shed leaked from 2 joints. The hay mower needed a part that was no longer easy to find. The barn roof had a soft section she did not trust. The small herd could cover groceries and maybe a few utilities, not a bank deadline. The plantable acres could produce later, perhaps, if she had seed time, weather, and luck. She had 69 days. Every solution seemed to arrive wearing a calendar she could not afford. Some nights, she sat at the kitchen table with Elias's old calculator and worked the numbers until the display blurred. Then she would stand, rinse the same mug, and start over, because stopping felt like betrayal. The calls from town did not help. People were kind in the careful way people become kind when they believe kindness will not have to cost them anything. They told her Elias was a good man. They told her nobody would blame her if she sold. They told her Miller had resources and would keep the place from going completely under. One woman from church said it might be God's way of freeing Grace from a burden. Grace thanked her and hung up before anger could climb into her voice. The farm had not been a burden when it fed people. It had not been a burden when her grandfather fixed neighbors' equipment for half price because winter was coming. It had not been a burden when people borrowed his post-hole digger, his truck, his time, his quiet strength. Only now, when the Carters were the ones in danger, did everyone become philosophical about letting go. On the 9th day after the funeral, Grace went into the repair shed. She had avoided it at first. The shed had been Elias's private kingdom, a long, low building that smelled of grease dust and sun-warmed metal. When Grace was little, she had been allowed to stand in the doorway but not wander inside. Elias would tell her there were blades, belts, unstable jacks, and 10,000 ways for a curious child to get hurt before supper. She believed him, mostly. Now the shed felt less dangerous than intimate. His tools hung in careful rows: wrenches, sorted by size, Coffee cans labeled in his blocky handwriting. Nails, washers, cotter pins, old spark plugs, pieces of machines he had kept because someday a piece of one broken thing might rescue another. Grace began sorting the shelves for anything she could sell. Near the back, behind a welding screen, stood an old metal cabinet she remembered from childhood. It had always been there, heavy and gray, positioned oddly over a section of plank floor. She tried to open it and found nothing inside but a cracked funnel, a roll of wire, and 2 empty oil cans. It was too heavy to be useful, and too empty to justify the place it occupied. Grace frowned. She pushed it. It did not move. She dragged a pry bar from the wall, wedged it under one edge, and rocked the cabinet just enough to hear something underneath shift with a dry, wooden click. The sound was small, but in an empty shed, grief teaches you to hear small things. Grace worked for nearly an hour, sweating through her shirt until the cabinet scraped sideways across the boards. Beneath it was a square outline cut into the floor, its edges dark with dust. A recessed iron ring sat flush against the wood. For a long moment, Grace did not touch it. Then she pulled. The trap door lifted with a groan. Cool air rose from below, carrying the smell of earth paper and old glass. A set of narrow wooden steps descended into darkness. Grace found a flashlight in the truck and climbed down slowly, one hand against the wall, her heart beating with a strange mixture of fear and recognition. The space beneath the shed was not large, more like a root cellar than a room, but it had been made carefully. Shelves lined 2 walls. Plastic bins sat labeled by year. Mason jars held ash lime and soil. Bundles of paper were wrapped in twine. Hand-drawn maps curled at the corners. Along the back wall, on a shelf protected from damp by a sheet of tin, sat a row of spiral notebooks. Grace lifted the first one. The cover was faded blue. Across the front, in Elias Carter's handwriting, were the words, West Plot, 1988. Grace sat on an overturned crate and opened it. The first pages were not emotional. That almost broke her. They were measurements, dates, weather, soil texture, pH readings, moisture notes, seed trials, amendments, failures, more failures. A small grid drawn by hand showed the dead patch divided into sections no larger than a modest backyard. Beside each square, Elias had written what he had tried. Wood ash, light application. Compost cow manure, weathered 6 months. Gypsum test strip. Deep fork, no tillage after rain. Cover crop, failed. Mustard, failed. Rye, partial. Wait. That word appeared again and again. Wait. Grace opened another notebook, then another. The years moved forward. 1993, 1998, 2004, 2011, 2017. Elias had not ignored the Westland. He had been studying it, patiently, quietly, without asking the town to believe him, without arguing at the feed store, without telling Miller anything useful. The early numbers were brutal. Some parts of the soil tested at a pH so low that ordinary crops would struggle before they even began. Salt crusting appeared after certain rains. Organic matter was almost non-existent. Compaction kept water from moving through, then held it in the wrong places when it finally did. Elias did not pretend otherwise. He wrote down every discouraging fact with the seriousness of a man who respected truth too much to soften it. But then the numbers began to change. Not quickly, never quickly. A pH reading of 4.1 became 4.6 in one grid after several careful seasons. Another rose to 5.2. A strip near the south edge reached 5.7, then slipped backward after a dry year. Elias wrote the setback down. He adjusted. He waited. He added organic matter in smaller amounts. He tested water movement with coffee cans open at both ends. He noted where earthworms appeared then disappeared, then returned. He tracked which corner held moisture after wind. He measured shade from a repaired fence line. He compared the smell of wet soil from the east field to the smell of wet soil from the west. Grace read until her knees went stiff and the flashlight dimmed. At the bottom of one page, Elias had written, "Do not force the whole field to heal at once. A body heals cell by cell." She pressed her fingers to the sentence. It sounded like him. In the last notebook, the handwriting had become shakier, but no less precise. Elias had circled a section just under half an acre. The grid was marked W4 South. The pH had reached 6.1. Salt levels had dropped enough to attempt a short-season crop. Organic matter remained low, but improving. Drainage was fragile, but usable if irrigated gently. The page had been folded once, as if he had returned to it often. At the top, he had written, "Ready for one more season." At the bottom, in smaller letters, he had written, "Patience is the only amendment money cannot buy." Grace sat in the cellar with the notebook open on her lap and cried so suddenly it frightened her. Not because the farm was saved. It was not yet. She cried because she had spent days feeling abandoned by a debt, and now she realized Elias had been trying year after year to leave her something more useful than sorrow. He had not had enough money to clear the note. He had not had enough strength left to plant the final crop. But he had left her a map of his stubborn hope. And hope, Grace knew, was not proof. But it was enough to make her stand up. The next morning, Grace loaded 3 soil samples, 2 notebooks, and the folder of photographs into her car and drove to the State Agricultural Extension Office. She arrived before lunch, wearing work boots, funeral dark circles under her eyes, and the kind of expression that makes receptionists decide not to ask too many questions. That was how she met Dr. Naomi Brooks. Naomi was a soil specialist who had worked on land recovery projects across the region, including small family farms damaged by overgrazing, runoff mining residue, and years of being told they were not worth saving. She was in her early 40s, with silver beginning at her temples and a voice that could be gentle without becoming soft. When Grace explained the debt, the deadline, the West acreage, and the notebooks, Naomi did not laugh. That mattered more than Grace expected. Naomi read the pages slowly. She asked where the samples came from. She asked how long Elias had stored records. She asked whether the area had standing water after spring rain. She asked about previous amendments, slope irrigation pressure, and whether Miller's North Ditch still overflowed during storms. Grace answered what she could and admitted what she could not. Then Naomi closed the notebook and said Elias had been more careful than many funded projects she had seen. Grace looked down because praise for him still felt like a hand pressing on a bruise. The lab results came back 3 days later. The entire West acreage was not ready, not even close. Some of it remained too unstable for planting. But the half-acre Elias had circled was different. Not perfect, not easy, not guaranteed, but alive enough to test. Alive enough? Those 2 words followed Grace home. Naomi visited the farm the next afternoon. She walked the west plot with a soil probe, kneeling now and then to crumble dirt between her fingers. She did not romanticize it. She pointed out the risks plainly. The structure was weak. The surface crust could return if Grace watered too heavily. The crop would need to mature quickly. There was little margin for weather, insects, equipment failure, or panic. Grace asked what she would plant if it were her farm. Naomi looked across the field for a long time before answering. Kennebec potatoes. They were practical, not glamorous. A dependable white potato with a history of performing under less than perfect conditions when managed well. Grace almost smiled at that. Elias would have liked a crop that did not care about looking impressive. The plan was tight. 200 pounds of seed potatoes, organic compost, a careful adjustment based on the latest soil test, not guesswork, low, steady irrigation, shallow cultivation only where necessary, mulch to protect moisture without smothering the soil, constant monitoring, documentation of every step because the bank would not be moved by Grace's feelings and Miller would not be moved by anything except losing. Naomi warned her that even if the crop succeeded, the harvest would not directly pay the full debt. Grace already knew. The potatoes were not the money. The potatoes were the argument. If Grace could prove that land listed as non-productive was returning to agricultural use, the farm's valuation could change. If the valuation changed, she might qualify for a conservation-backed refinancing option or a family farm recovery loan. If she could show income potential with professional confirmation, the bank might extend the deadline instead of forcing foreclosure. It was not a rescue. It was a narrow bridge over a deep hole. Grace crossed it anyway. She spent nearly every dollar she could spare on seed compost, fuel replacement hose, and lab fees. She sold the broken stock trailer for less than it was worth because time had become more expensive than pride. She called her landlord in Denver and gave notice on her apartment. She packed her life into boxes, drove them north, and stacked them in her childhood bedroom beneath old 4-H ribbons she had not thought about in years. At the farm supply store, the clerk looked at the delivery address and paused. The pause said enough. Then a man near the counter asked if she was really putting seed into the Carter West patch. Another said some ground was called dead for a reason. Someone else muttered that educated people could be the slowest to learn common sense. Grace signed the receipt. She did not defend the land. Defense would come later if the land chose to speak. Word reached Miller before the seed potatoes did. He drove along the fence that evening while Grace was marking the rows with twine and short stakes. The sun was low, flattening his shadow across the ground, as if he wanted even that to trespass. He told her Elias had wasted years on that patch. He said old men sometimes confused stubbornness with wisdom. He said she was turning grief into bad math. Grace kept measuring. Miller raised his voice just enough for the hired hand beside him to hear. He said when the bank took the place, he would make a fair offer for the whole property. Fair, he said, meant realistic. Grace finally looked up. She told him realism was exactly what her grandfather had written down. Miller's smile tightened. He looked toward the stakes in the ground and said a few rows of potatoes would not change a thing. At the time, Grace feared he might be right. Planting began before sunrise 2 days later. The air still carried spring cold. Grace cut seed potatoes by the porch light, each piece with its eyes intact, each piece given time to callus the way Naomi had instructed. Her hands smelled of earth and starch. Elias's notebook lay open beside the crate, weighted with a wrench so the wind would not turn the pages. When the tractor refused to start, Grace sat behind the wheel for 10 full seconds with her forehead against the steering wheel. Then she climbed down, checked fuel, checked the battery, cleaned a connection, cursed once in a voice that would have made Elias raise an eyebrow, and tried again. The engine caught on the third attempt. It sounded terrible. It also moved. That was enough. The first pass over the half-acre felt like entering an argument already in progress. The soil did not welcome her. It clodded. It resisted. It broke unevenly. Twice she stopped to clear debris. Once the tractor coughed so hard she thought the whole plan would die before lunch. But by afternoon, the rows were open, the seed was placed, and Grace covered them by hand where the machine had done a poor job. Every movement cost time. Every hour cost money. Every mistake cost confidence. At night, Grace soaked her hands in a metal bowl at the kitchen sink. Blisters rose along her palms, then tore, then hardened into a new map of work. Her shoulders ached so badly she learned to sleep on her back. She kept Elias's notebooks on the table, but she also kept Naomi's printed instructions beside them because hope without method had ruined plenty of farms before hers. That was the first lesson the West plot taught her. Love the land, yes, but measure it too. For the first week, nothing happened. Grace knew enough about potatoes to expect that, but knowledge did not make waiting easier. Each morning she walked the rows before coffee boots, sinking slightly into the darkened soil, looking for a sign she knew might not yet be visible. Each evening she checked moisture with her fingers and wrote notes in a new spiral notebook of her own. She did not write like Elias at first. Her notes were tense. Row 2, too dry near north edge. Possible crust after wind. Irrigation leak at joint again. No emergence. No emergence. Still no emergence. The phrase began to feel personal. On the 8th day, a windstorm came down from the ridge, hard enough to rattle the window glass. It carried dust across the yard, slapped loose tin on the barn roof, and tore one of the temporary irrigation lines from its coupling. Grace ran outside in a jacket over her pajamas and fought the hose in the dark, while water beat against her knees and pooled where it should not. By the time she shut the valve, one section of the field had been soaked too heavily, and another had been left dry. She stood there in the beam of her flashlight, breathing hard. The old fear came for her then. Not fear of failure in the clean, motivational sense people talk about after they have already survived it. This was uglier. This was the fear that she had misunderstood everything, that grief had made her reckless, that Elias's notes were only the record of a lonely man trying not to admit defeat, that Miller, for all his cruelty, understood the world better than she did. The next morning she called Naomi before sunrise. Naomi listened, asked precise questions, then told her what to do. Drain the low spots gently. Break the surface crust by hand, not with heavy equipment. Mark the damaged area. Do not overcorrect. Do not punish the whole field for one bad night. Grace almost laughed when she heard it. Do not punish the whole field for one bad night. She wrote that in her notebook. The days that followed became a rhythm so demanding it left little room for anything except the next necessary act. Repair, test, water, wait, record, adjust. She took part-time remote work reviewing produce reports at night because cash was bleeding away faster than she could admit. Her laptop sat beside Elias's notebooks under the yellow kitchen light. The internet cut out whenever the wind changed. She would upload inspection forms, then step outside with a headlamp to check whether the repaired hose was holding pressure. Neighbors noticed. Some slowed down on the road. A few lifted a hand. Most kept driving. One afternoon, an older man named Calvin Price stopped his truck near the gate. He had known Elias for 40 years, though Grace remembered him mostly as a man who brought broken balers to the shed and left with them working. He leaned on the gate and watched Grace carry compost in 5-gallon buckets because the tractor could not get close enough without compacting the row edges. Calvin asked if she needed help. Grace had become so used to skepticism that the offer startled her. She almost said no. Then she looked at the buckets, the field, the sky, and the 69-day clock in her head. She said yes. Calvin came back the next morning with his teenage grandson and a small trailer. He did not make speeches. He did not call the project foolish or brave. He simply asked where the compost needed to go. By noon, 2 more people had stopped. One brought old drip fittings. Another brought a roll of row cover with a tear down one side. People still doubted. Grace could feel it. But doubt with a shovel in its hand was different from doubt leaning out a truck window. Miller saw that too. His pressure changed. He stopped joking from the fence and started making calls. Grace learned this from the banker who let slip during a tense conversation that Miller had inquired whether the Carter note could be purchased before foreclosure. The banker did not say more, but Grace understood enough. Miller was not merely waiting for the farm to fail. He was trying to position himself close enough to catch it when it fell. That knowledge should have frightened her. It did, but it also clarified something. Miller did not behave like a man watching worthless land. He behaved like a man afraid someone else might prove it had value. On the 18th day after planting, Grace found the first shoot. It was small, no taller than her thumb, a tight green fold pushing through soil that had been gray and hard for most of her life. Grace crouched beside it for a long time, afraid that if she breathed too hard, it might vanish. Then she laughed. It came out broken and wet and surprised. She took a photograph, then another from a different angle, then one with the row marker in frame. She sent it to Naomi with no message. A minute later, Naomi replied with 3 words, "Keep documenting everything." By the end of the week, more shoots appeared, not evenly, not perfectly. Some rows were stronger than others. The overwatered corner lagged. The north edge remained stubborn. But the field had changed color. From the porch, the west plot no longer looked like a scar. It looked like a question being answered slowly in green. Grace sent weekly packets to the bank, photographs, soil moisture notes, lab updates, Naomi's preliminary assessment, a projected harvest timeline, a request for a 30-day extension based on active agricultural recovery and potential reclassification of previously non-productive acreage. The first response was no. It arrived by email while Grace was repairing a fence hinge. She read it on her phone standing in the yard, a coil of wire at her feet. The language was formal, but the meaning was simple. The bank was not prepared to alter the timeline based on unharvested crops. For a moment, Grace felt the farm tilt away from her. She had known the answer might be no. Knowing did not protect her. She walked into the house, sat at the kitchen table, and opened Elias's final notebook. Not because it had legal power, because she needed to put her hands on something that had survived longer than one rejection. The folded page opened to the half-acre grid, ready for one more season. Grace read it 3 times. Then she called Naomi. Naomi did not promise anything. She said banks liked proof but feared uncertainty. The job was to make uncertainty smaller. She offered to write a formal professional letter, not emotional, not dramatic, just clear. The land had measurable improvement. The crop emergence was consistent with viable production. The project qualified for review under conservation and family farm recovery criteria if yield met projected thresholds. Denying time before inspection could force liquidation of an asset whose status was actively changing. It was the kind of sentence Grace could never have written while crying at a kitchen table. Naomi wrote it before midnight. Grace attached it to a new appeal, along with photographs taken every 3 days from the same marked points, copies of Elias's historical pH logs, and a simple spreadsheet showing measurable change over time. She included no plea about heritage, no mention of guilt, no claim that the farm deserved mercy because it had once belonged to a good man. She made the argument in the language the bank had demanded. Numbers, proof, potential. Then she waited. The waiting was worse than the work. Work gave the body somewhere to put fear. Waiting left fear loose in the room. During that week, the potatoes grew fast enough to be visible day by day. Grace learned their moods. Leaves that lifted after watering, leaves that dulled after hot wind, soil that cracked where she had been too cautious, soil that sealed where she had been too generous. She hilled the rows by hand in the fragile sections. Calvin's grandson helped after school twice and admitted with the embarrassment of a 16-year-old saying anything sincere that the field looked kind of cool. Grace took that as high praise. Miller came by less often, but his presence did not disappear. His truck moved along the fence road at odd times. Once, Grace found tire tracks near the west gate after rain. Nothing was damaged, but she installed a trail camera the next day and changed the lock. Another time, a rumor reached her that the crop had failed, and she was faking pictures from another farm. Naomi advised her to ignore it, unless it affected the bank. Grace did not ignore it exactly. She simply converted anger into more documentation. Every row photographed, every test labeled, every visitor noted. The farm that had once survived by memory now began to defend itself by record. On the 41st day after Grace first read the foreclosure notice, the bank agreed to send a representative for an on-site review. Not a promise, not forgiveness. A review. Grace cried again, but this time she did it standing up. The representative arrived in a gray sedan that looked lost on the gravel road. His name was Mr. Harlan. He was younger than Grace expected, with careful shoes and the expression of a man trained not to appear impressed too quickly. Naomi came too, carrying a clipboard and a soil probe. Calvin leaned near the gate, pretending not to watch. Miller arrived uninvited. He parked where everyone could see him and greeted Mr. Harlan by name, which told Grace plenty about how small towns worked when money wore clean boots. Miller said he was only there as a neighboring landowner with an interest in regional agricultural stability. Grace nearly choked on the phrase. The inspection began at the house, then moved to the machinery, the pasture, the east fields, and finally the west plot. Grace had imagined this moment many times. In her imagination she spoke with eloquence. She defended her grandfather. She made everyone understand the moral weight of the land. In reality, she mostly answered questions. How many pounds of seed? What date planted? What amendments applied? What irrigation schedule? Which rows showed delayed emergence? Which lab produced the tests? Naomi handled the technical explanations when necessary. Grace handled the records. She showed the marked photo points, the notebook entries, the old pH logs, the new test results, the cost receipts, the projected harvest date. The more questions Mr. Harlan asked, the calmer Grace became. Not because the risk was gone, but because the work was real. It had details, it had sequence, it had weight. Miller interrupted near the south edge of the plot. He said young plants did not make productive land. He said anyone could coax a little green out of bad soil for a few weeks. He said the bank should consider long-term viability, not a sentimental science project. For the first time all morning, Naomi looked directly at him. She said, long-term viability was exactly what 35 years of records suggested. Miller laughed once, but nobody joined him. Mr. Harlan asked to see the records again. Grace handed him Elias's final notebook. She had been reluctant to let anyone else hold it. The pages felt too personal, almost like skin. But as Harlan turned them carefully, Grace saw the effect she had seen in Naomi's office. The handwriting did what Grace's anger could not. It made the years visible. It made patience concrete. It made the dead land less of an opinion and more of a case study. Harlan did not grant the extension on the spot. Bankers do not like making hope look easy. But 2 days later, Grace received the letter. 30 additional days. Conditional upon harvest inspection, yield verification, and formal review of the West Plot's production status. Grace read the letter in the kitchen, then placed it beside Elias's notebook. For the first time since coming home, she let herself sleep through the night. The final month was not gentle. Hope can be exhausting once it becomes possible. The potato plants filled out, then demanded more attention. Insects appeared on the underside of leaves. Grace caught them early, because Naomi had taught her where to look. A dry spell forced her to ration water carefully between the recovering plot and the rest of the farm. The old pump began whining in a way Calvin did not like. He came over with a tool bag and spent half a Saturday coaxing it back from failure. Grace paid him with the last of Elias's canned peaches from the cellar and a promise that future payments would involve actual money. Calvin told her peaches counted better than most checks he had seen. Some evenings Grace walked the rows and spoke to Elias in her head. She told him she was angry he had not told her. She told him she was sorry she had not asked better questions when he was alive. She told him his tractor was a menace. She told him the field was trying. The strange thing about grief is that it can make the dead feel both absent and everywhere. Elias was not there to stand beside her, but his handwriting was in the shed. His repairs were in the pump. His saved jars were in the cellar. His stubbornness was in the soil itself, not as magic, but as evidence of hands returning after disappointment. Grace began to understand that inheritance was not only receiving what someone owned. Sometimes Inheritance was being asked to continue what they could not finish. Miller made one final attempt before harvest. He came to the porch near dusk with a new offer. This one was higher than the first, but still far below what the land could become if the west plot was reclassified. He spoke more softly this time, almost kindly, which made Grace distrust him more. He said she had done admirable work, but one crop would not change the realities of farming. He said weather could turn, markets could turn, banks could turn. He said she could take his offer, pay the debt, walk away with money, and remember Elias without being crushed by his dream. Grace listened from the top step. Miller mistook her silence for weakness and placed the contract on the porch rail. He told her she would never get a better chance. Grace looked past him toward the west field where the potato plants darkened in the falling light. Then she told him the chance he was describing had always been his, not hers. He did not understand, or maybe he did, and that was why he left without another word. The night before harvest, Grace could not sleep. She walked through the house, touching things she had stopped noticing because they had always been there. The dent in the pantry door from when she had tried to carry a bucket too wide for her arms. The pencil marks on the kitchen trim where Elias had measured her height until she was 17 and pretended to be annoyed by it. The repaired chair at the table, one rung darker than the others. The window above the sink where she had watched thunderstorms roll over the plains as a child, safe because Elias was somewhere nearby, shutting gates before the rain. She went to the repair shed close to midnight and climbed down into the cellar one more time. The air was cool. The jars waited on their shelves. The notebooks sat in order. Grace took the final one and turned to the last page. Patience is the only amendment money cannot buy. For the first time, the sentence did not make her cry. It steadied her. Harvest morning arrived bright and windless. By 8 o'clock, vehicles lined the drive. Mr. Harlan from the bank came with a printed form and a face more serious than the weather required. Naomi arrived in field clothes, not office clothes, which Grace appreciated more than she could say. A state agriculture officer named Dennis Shaw came to verify the yield and collect soil samples. Calvin came with his grandson. A few neighbors gathered near the fence, some embarrassed by their curiosity, some openly invested now that the field had refused to die on schedule. Miller came last. Of course he did. He parked his polished truck where the sun caught the chrome and stood with his arms crossed. He looked calm, but Grace noticed he did not smile as easily that morning. The plan was simple. Lift several test rows. First, document the result, then harvest the marked section, while Dennis weighed sample loads and Naomi recorded conditions. Grace had checked the tractor twice. Calvin had checked it a third time, because men like Calvin trust machines only after personally insulting them into cooperation. When Grace climbed into the tractor seat, her hands trembled. She looked once at the field, then at the people, then at the shed where Elias's notebooks waited below the floor. She started the engine. The tractor shook hard enough to make the hood rattle. For one terrible moment, Grace thought it would stall. Then the engine caught its rhythm, rough but committed. She eased forward. The blade entered the first row. Soil lifted. Nothing appeared. Only dirt. Grace heard Miller make a sound behind her. Not a laugh exactly. A breath prepared for one. The tractor moved another few feet. The soil rolled again, and the first potato came up. Then 3 more. Then a cluster still connected by pale roots, tumbling out of the ridge as if the ground had been holding its tongue for decades, and finally decided to speak all at once. Nobody moved. Grace stopped the tractor, climbed down, and knelt in the row. She reached into the loosened soil with both hands and pulled up another plant. Potatoes hung beneath it, solid and clean. Some small, some nearly the size of her palm. Not perfect, not miraculous in the cheap sense. Real, weight-bearing, countable. Naomi exhaled first. Calvin's grandson whispered something under his breath that sounded like awe. trying to hide inside teenage embarrassment. Dennis stepped forward with his scale. The harvest continued for hours. Every row told a slightly different story. The overwatered section underperformed, just as Grace's notes had predicted. The north edge produced smaller potatoes. The central beds, the ones Elias had marked as most stable, yielded strongest. That mattered. It showed the records were not fantasy, shaped after the fact. They were predictive. The old man had known his field. By midday, the tally reached 1,140 pounds of marketable Kennebec potatoes. From less than half an acre of land, the county had written off as dead. The number did not erase the debt. It did something more important. It changed the category. Dennis collected the final samples. Naomi reviewed the yield. Mr. Harlan made notes, asked for copies of the measurements, and walked the rows again with a different expression than the one he had arrived with. He no longer looked like a man inspecting a liability. He looked like a man recalculating. Miller stayed near his truck. For once, he had nothing useful to say. Late that afternoon, while volunteers loaded the potatoes into crates, Grace carried one crate to the porch and set it beside the contract Miller had left there days earlier. She had not touched the papers until then. The top page had curled slightly from the weather. Miller approached when he saw her pick it up. His voice had changed again. The kindness was gone. Now he sounded brisk, transactional, irritated that the world had failed to follow the shape he preferred. He said he could increase the offer. He said the harvest proved potential, but potential required capital, and capital required partners. He said she should be realistic about scaling restoration. He said no bank program would move quickly enough to protect her without complications. Grace looked at the field, at Naomi writing numbers on a clipboard, at Calvin laughing with his grandson over a crate of potatoes, at Mr. Harlan speaking quietly with Dennis. Then she looked at Miller. She told him he had only seen value after other people could measure it. Her grandfather had seen it when the field still looked worthless. Miller's jaw tightened. Grace tore the contract in half, not dramatically, not with a speech loud enough for the road, just once down the middle, then once again, and dropped the pieces into the porch trash. The sound was small, but Miller heard it. Within 2 weeks, the State Agriculture Office updated the status of the marked half-acre from recovering ground to conditionally productive agricultural land. The wording was cautious because officials prefer caution, but the effect was enormous. With the new classification, the documented yield, Naomi's report, and Elias's long-term records, Grace qualified for a conservation-based family farm loan designed for small farms restoring damaged acreage. The process still nearly wore her down. There were forms, inspections, signatures, corrections, more forms, and one missing attachment that almost delayed everything by 10 days. Grace drove documents to the office herself because she no longer trusted any system that moved slower than foreclosure. Naomi reviewed the technical parts. Mr. Harlan, to his credit, stopped sounding like a locked door and began sounding like a man trying to find the right key. By mid-July, the new financing was approved. Grace paid off the old debt. The Carter farm did not become easy after that. That is important. Some stories make survival sound like a single, shining moment, as if one harvest fixes rot in a roof, age in a tractor, grief in a kitchen, and years of neglected accounts. Real farms do not work that way. The west plot still needed care. The rest of the 6 acres remained fragile. The irrigation system needed repairs more expensive than Grace wanted to think about. The cattle still had to be managed. The house still had drafts. The tractor still started only after making Grace question every life choice that had brought her within 10 feet of it. But the farm had time. And time was the thing Elias had been trying to buy with patience, long before any bank understood its value. Grace sold part of the first harvest locally. She donated several crates to the church pantry under Elias's name. She kept one crate in the kitchen longer than necessary because every time she passed it, she felt the impossible become ordinary in the best possible way. News spread. At first, people told the story badly. They called it luck. They called it a miracle crop. They said Grace had saved the farm in 69 days, as if the 35 years before she returned were just background music. Grace corrected them, gently at first, then firmly. She had not saved the land alone. Elias had started before she knew enough to care. Naomi had brought science and credibility. Calvin and the others had brought hands when skepticism finally became help. And the land itself had not come back because someone believed in it loudly. It came back because someone had treated it as living, even when it gave almost nothing in return. By autumn, Miller's influence had thinned in a way money could not immediately repair. He still owned what he owned. He still sat where he sat. But people had seen him wrong in public, and not just wrong about potatoes. Wrong about value. Wrong about patience. Wrong about who had been foolish and who had been paying attention. When the county reviewed drainage issues along the North Ditch, Grace submitted Elias's notes and Naomi's reports. The review did not destroy Miller, and Grace did not need it to. It required corrective work that should have been done years earlier, and this time Miller had to sign papers instead of offering them. That was enough. Poetic justice does not always arrive as ruin. Sometimes it arrives as a man who used to control every conversation being forced to listen while other people read the measurements. 1 year later, the west side of the Carter farm no longer looked like a warning. It looked unfinished, which Grace had come to understand was not the same thing. The original half-acre was in rotation. Another section had been planted with a cover crop. Compost rows steamed near the shed. Test flags marked places still too risky to disturb. A new irrigation line ran low and steady where the old one had wasted pressure. The soil was not rich everywhere. Some places still resisted. Grace no longer took that personally. She had learned to ask what each patch was ready for, not what she wished it would become. In the farmhouse kitchen, she framed the last page of Elias's notebook and hung it near the window. Patience is the only amendment money cannot buy. People often paused when they saw it. Some smiled politely. Some read it twice. Naomi read it once and said Elias would have annoyed every grant committee she had ever worked with because he had been too right for too long without permission. Grace laughed until she had to sit down. The laugh surprised her. It had taken a year for laughter to stop feeling like disrespect. That spring, Grace founded the Elias Carter Soil Cooperative. It began simply with 3 folding tables in the equipment shed, a donated microscope, Naomi's guidance, and a sign Calvin painted on scrap wood. Small farmers brought jars of soil, not because Grace had all the answers, but because she knew what it felt like to stand over damaged ground while richer people offered to take it off your hands. She helped them label samples, read basic reports, understand pH, ask better questions, and avoid anyone who tried to turn their desperation into a discount. The cooperative especially welcomed young black growers who wanted to enter agriculture but had inherited more barriers than acres. Grace opened a small training plot on the southern edge of the farm. She taught what Elias had taught her, but also what Elias had hidden, because his generation had learned to protect hope by keeping it quiet. She taught them to document everything, to respect elders without turning their silence into a museum, to test soil before trusting rumors, to accept help without surrendering ownership, to know the difference between land that is dead and land that has been waiting for someone patient enough to learn its language. One afternoon during the cooperative's first summer workshop, a 12-year-old boy held up a potato he had dug from the demonstration row and asked Grace if this was the famous kind. Grace told him there was nothing famous about the potato. Then she looked at the field, at the shed, at the house, at the horizon her grandfather had watched for most of his life. She said the famous thing was the waiting. That night, after everyone left, Grace walked alone to the west plot. The sun was lowering behind the ridge, turning the soil bronze in some places and black in others. Wind moved through the cover crop with a soft brushing sound. She knelt and pressed her hand flat to the ground. For years, people had looked at that surface and decided the story was over. They saw crust. They saw failure. They saw a reason to offer less than something was worth. Elias had looked longer. He had seen injury, not finality. He had seen a slow problem that required a slow love. He had known that a field like a family could carry damage beneath the surface and still hold the possibility of repair. He had done what he could with what he had. A jar of ash, a notebook, a pH strip, a shovel, a season, another season, another. No applause, no guarantee, no proof anyone else respected. Grace used to think inheritance meant getting what was left. Now she understood that sometimes inheritance means becoming the person who can finally use what was prepared. The Carter farm did not survive because Grace was fearless. She was afraid almost every day. Afraid of the bank, afraid of Miller, afraid of weather, afraid of being exposed as a city woman playing farmer on land her grandfather had understood in ways she never would. But courage, she learned, is not the absence of that fear. It is the decision to keep taking measurements while your hands shake. It is fixing the hose in the dark. It is asking for help before pride turns into another form of loss. It is planting a crop that cannot pay the debt by itself, because the real harvest is proof. It is refusing to sell a story just because someone powerful has already written an ending that benefits him. On the anniversary of Elias's passing, Grace placed a small basket of Kennebec potatoes on his grave. It was not elegant. Elias would have preferred useful things over flowers anyway. She stood there with the Montana wind pulling at her coat and told him the West Field was not finished. She told him the North Ditch Review had gone through. She told him the cooperative had 12 members now. She told him Calvin's grandson wanted to study agricultural engineering. She told him Miller still looked irritated whenever he drove past, which she knew Elias would have considered a small but respectable blessing. Then she told him she was sorry, not for leaving. She had begun to forgive herself for that. People are allowed to build lives beyond the places that raised them. She was sorry for thinking his quiet was emptiness. For mistaken the years, he did not explain himself, for years in which nothing was happening. For forgetting that some kinds of love do not announce themselves. They accumulate. They sit in jars. They wait in notebooks. They change the chemistry of a field one season at a time. Grace left the cemetery and drove home before sunset. The farm appeared gradually, first as a roof line, then a windbreak, then the repaired gate, then the long shape of the shed. She parked by the house and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel. The place no longer felt like a test she had been given after failing to visit enough. It felt like a conversation she had finally rejoined. Inside the kitchen, the framed notebook page caught the last light from the window. The words were simple. Anyone could read them in a few seconds. Patience is the only amendment money cannot buy. But Grace knew now what the sentence cost. It cost Elias 35 years of being misunderstood. It cost him labor no one praised, records no one requested, and hope he had to protect from people who would have mocked it if they had seen it too early. It cost Grace 69 days of fear, one ruined pair of boots, most of her savings, and the painful discovery that coming home too late is still better than never coming home at all. And it gave the Carter family something Miller could never buy. Not just the farm, not just the crop, not even the victory. It gave them the right to define the land by its future instead of by its worst season. That is why people still tell the story of Grace Carter and the West Plot. Not because potatoes are dramatic, they are not. Not because every damaged field can be restored in one season. It cannot. Not because patience magically fixes everything. It does not. They tell it because so many people know what it feels like to be misnamed by a hard season. Dead, Finished. Too late. Not worth the trouble. They know what it feels like when someone stands at the fence of your life and offers you less than you are worth, because they are betting you are too tired to keep fighting. And they need to remember that a surface can lie. A field can look barren while roots are preparing underneath. A family can look finished while one person is still keeping records in the dark. A dream can look foolish right up until the morning it comes out of the ground with weight, shape, and witnesses. So if you are standing over some part of your life that other people have already called dead, Grace Carter's story does not ask you to pretend the damage is not real. The damage was real. The debt was real. The deadline was real. The soil tests were real. But damage is not always a verdict. Sometimes it is a condition. And conditions can change when truth, patience, work, and the right kind of help meet in the same field. Grace did not save the Carter farm by believing harder than everyone else. She saved it by listening to the evidence her grandfather left behind, adding her own hands to his, and refusing to let a rich man's contempt become the final measurement of her inheritance. The first potato did not pay the bank, but it proved the land was alive. And after that, nobody could call it dead without lying.